Part 1. The obituary on the screen. Exactly 212 words. That was the length of the obituary draft sitting on my 13-inch laptop screen. At the bottom of the document, the glowing cursor blinked next to a date, October 14, 2021. The air in my tiny studio apartment on Tremont Street smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap laundry detergent. On the small kitchen counter, a ceramic mug was still warm to the touch. I sat at the wooden desk, my spine absolutely stiff, staring at the blue-tinted screen while my right hand shook so violently I had to grip my wrist with my left. Just 30 seconds ago, my lungs were collapsing. I could still feel the rush of the Boston night air roaring past my ears as I plunged 22 stories down from the glass balcony of the Hancock penthouse. I could still hear the precise, clean sound of my chest ribs cracking against the cold brick sidewalk of Clarendon Street. In that final second of impact, Julian Hayes had been looking down from the balcony above. He was not screaming, he was not crying out for help. He had simply adjusted his silk tie, turned his back to the edge, and walked back into the warm light of the apartment that I had bought with my own inheritance. Now I was looking at my hand. It was soft, unbruised, and completely free of the silver band Julian would slide onto my finger exactly 1 year from now. My knuckles were pale, but the bones inside were whole. There was no blood on my gray woolen sweater. My sister, Clara Thorne, was officially pronounced dead 4 hours ago. According to the official police report lying on my desk, her compact sedan had drifted over the guardrail on Interstate 93 under heavy rain. The state police called it a tragic loss of control. Last time I believed every word of that report, I had spent 3 weeks crying into Julian's chest, while he gently guided me toward signing over Clara's share of the Thorne Logistics family estate to safekeep in his private equity fund. Last time I did not know that Julian had rented a black utility van in Worcester under a fake corporation name on the morning of October 14th. I did not know that he had followed Clara's car from her office in Back Bay, all the way to the expressway. This time the paper report under my hands felt cold, but the knowledge inside my mind was burning hot. I reached for the cold mug of coffee, my fingers steadying as the reality of my survival sank deep into my chest. The phantom pain of the pavement below began to recede, leaving only a sharp, icy clarity. The screen in front of me showed the draft of Clara's memorial service program. The digital cursor was still blinking, a tiny line of black light ticking down the seconds of a second chance. Part 2. The $30 million coldness. In our family, Clara had always been the golden child, while I was the quiet backup plan. Our father, David Thorne, was the third-generation owner of Thorne Logistics, a shipping empire that moved 60% of the medical supplies along the East Coast. But David was also a man who measured his daughters in terms of mergers and tax liabilities. Clara was headstrong, a certified public accountant who had graduated from Boston College at 21 and immediately stepped into our father's finance division. She had discovered the massive discrepancy in the family pension funds within 4 months of her arrival. I, on the other hand, was the quiet daughter who studied library sciences and worked at the historic Boston Athenaeum. David regarded my career with a silent, heavy contempt. Whenever we sat at the long dining table in the Newton mansion, David would talk exclusively to Clara about stock buybacks and dry dock leasing. My stepmother, Eleanor, would spend those dinners criticizing the length of my skirts, the softness of my voice, and my apparent lack of ambition. "You should be more like your sister, Madeline," Eleanor would whisper, sliding a plate of low-calorie greens toward me. "A quiet woman in Boston is just a woman waiting to be forgotten." Because of that constant isolation, when Julian Hayes entered our lives 2 weeks after Clara's funeral, I had been desperate for someone to look at me as if I were visible. Julian was a junior partner at Sterling Hayes Management, a firm that specialized in asset protection for the New England old money families. He was handsome in a very calculated, blue-blooded way. He wore perfectly tailored charcoal suits, drove an olive green Land Rover, and possessed a voice that sounded like smooth caramel sliding over gravel. He had met me at Clara's wake, standing under the massive oak tree outside the church, holding an extra umbrella. He told me he had worked briefly with Clara on her tax planning and felt a deep, professional duty to support the surviving sister. Within 6 months, he had convinced me to let him manage my personal inheritance. Within 18 months, he had used my power of attorney to vote against my father on the board of Thorne Logistics, paving the way for a hostile takeover by Sterling Hayes. By the time I discovered the secret transactions, Clara's $30 million estate was gone, buried deep in offshore shell companies registered in Delaware. And when I threatened to take those digital bank rank records to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Julian invited me out to the balcony to look at the autumn stars. I closed the laptop on my Tremont Street desk, the snap of the screen echoing like a small gunshot in the quiet room. My father was currently expecting me to mail this obituary draft to the Boston Herald before 5 p.m. Instead of opening my email, I pulled up my banking app. My current balance was $84,000, a modest sum left to me by my maternal grandmother. It was not enough to fight a private equity firm, but it was enough to buy information. My phone vibrated against the wood, a text from my father flashing across the screen. Is the memorial write-up ready? The Herald needs the proof. Don't embarrass the family with poor grammar, Madeleine. I deleted the text. I got up, grabbed my beige trench coat from the hook by the door, and took the keys to my 5-year-old hatchback. I needed to see a lawyer before Julian Hayes could even register my existence in this timeline. Part 3: The Boring Attorney. The offices of Sterling Thorne Legal did not look like the glass towers of financial giants. They were located on the 3rd floor of an old brick building on State Street, where the wooden floorboards smelled of linseed oil and 90-year-old ink. Vance Miller was the estate attorney currently assigned to process the residual assets of Clara's private accounts. When I first met him in my previous life, I had thought him incredibly boring. He wore tortoiseshell glasses that constantly slid down his nose, off-the-rack navy suits that looked slightly too large for his lean frame, and he had a habit of adjusting his cuffs whenever he was nervous. I had ignored his quiet warnings to read every single line of the trust agreements before I signed them. I had dismissed him as a paper pusher who did not understand the grand scale of modern finance. But in my final year, when I was desperately trying to build a legal case against Julian, I found out that Vance had spent 3 years collecting files on Julian's shell companies on his own time. Vance was not a boring attorney. He was an incredibly patient predator who had been waiting for the right weapon. I walked into his office without an appointment. His receptionist, an older woman with silver hair, looked up from her typing, but I pushed right past her desk and opened the heavy frosted glass door to Vance's private office. Vance was sitting behind a desk piled high with blue cardboard files. He looked up, his fingers freezing over an old-fashioned legal pad. He adjusted his glasses, his pale blue eyes blinking with mild surprise. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice flat but perfectly polite. "I was under the impression you were with your father in Newton today, handling your sister's personal affairs." I closed the heavy mahogany door behind me and turned the brass lock. "My sister did not die because her tires slipped on wet asphalt, Mr. Miller," I said, walking to his desk and placing both hands flat on the polished wood. "She was killed because she found $42 million in foreign liabilities inside my father's corporate pension fund." Vance did not call security. He did not even look startled. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, the leather squeaking softly in the quiet office, and let his hands slowly clasp together over his chest. "That is a very specific and very dangerous allegation, Miss Thorne," he said softly, looking at the door to ensure it was indeed locked. "The Massachusetts State Police have already closed the initial investigation into the crash on 93. It is ruled an accident. They did not search the traffic camera footage on the ramp leading from Route 3 in Worcester," I replied, speaking with a calm, freezing authority that made Vance's eyebrows lift slightly. "If you request the State Transportation Archives for that highway branch between 9 and 10:30 this morning, you will find a black utility van registered to a logistics sub-entity called Devon LLC." Vance remained entirely motionless. "Devon LLC is one of Sterling Hayes' private real estate holders. How do you have that name?" "Because my sister's office printer has a log of the last 7 documents she scanned yesterday afternoon," I lied, creating a logical trail using the facts I had painstakingly learned before my death. "She didn't save them to the server, Mr. Miller. She printed physical copies of Devon LLC's tax registration and mailed them to an address in Brookline." Vance adjusted his glasses, but this time his hands were not nervous, they were incredibly steady. "To what address in Brookline?" he asked. "To your private residence," I said, leaning closer until I could see my own determined reflection in his lenses. "But they won't arrive for another 2 days, because she used standard shipping. You need to pull the postal routing before the regional processing center delivers it, because Julian Hayes has a contact inside the postal registry. Vance's gaze went completely sharp. The dull, boring estate lawyer mask slipped away, revealing a calculating intellect. How could you possibly know my home address, Miss Thorne? I have kept that listing entirely private for 6 years. I did not blink. I remember it from the lawsuit filing we never got to submit, I thought. You gave it to my sister during your meeting last month at the Boston Public Library's courtyard, I said aloud. You thought my father's house was too exposed. You were right. Vance stood up. He walked to the window overlooking State Street, his eyes tracing the red brick facade of the buildings across the road. If this is true, he said, keeping his back to me, the documents coming to my home contain enough raw banking codes to destroy not just Julian Hayes, but your father's entire shipperm as well. I know. Are you prepared for your father to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary? My father was willing to sign off on a falsified accident report to protect his pension surplus, I replied, the absolute coldness in my heart reflecting in my steady voice. He gave my sister's personal items to Julian this afternoon without even checking her bedroom drawer. He has already chosen his path, Mr. Miller. I am choosing mine. Vance turned back to me. There was a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I think we should take a short drive to the sorting facility in South Boston, he said, grabbing his wool coat. Part 4. The Barricade of the Defeating Trut. To defeat Julian Hayes, I had to ensure that our first moves remained entirely hidden from his high-priced security team. In my previous life, Julian had a personal secretary named Evelyn Vance, a young woman who was intensely loyal to him because he was secretly paying for her brother's specialized medical treatments. She was his eyes and ears inside the financial registry. While Vance drove us south in his unassuming, 10-year-old gray sedan, I pulled up my personal calendar. Tomorrow afternoon was the formal reading of Clara's initial estate instructions at our family home in Newton. In the first timeline, Julian had attended this meeting as our legal guest, presenting himself as an expert consultant to help comfort my father. But I had the ultimate weapon of the reborn. I knew what Julian did not yet know. I knew he was missing a key document to complete his leverage over the Thorne Logistics shares. To secure control over the board of directors, Julian needed Clara's original handwritten stock ledger. Without it, he could not bypass the trust clause that required both daughters to sign off on major liquidations. I had previously found that ledger tucked inside an old box of recipes in Clara's apartment when I was cleaning it out 2 weeks after her death. Like a fool, I had handed it directly to Julian. This time the ledger would not be there. Vance pulled his car into the back parking lot of the massive distribution center in South Boston. He got out and made a quick phone call, his voice low and rhythmic, using legal jargon that suggested he had strong connections deep inside the regional logistics offices. 10 minutes later, he came back with a heavy yellow paper envelope under his arm. He climbed back into the driver's seat, his face slightly pale. You were correct, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The package from Clara's work terminal was in the priority routing tray. I used my estate authority to pull it before it reached my home delivery bin. Did you open it? I asked. He didn't speak. He simply pulled a single sheet of paper from the side pocket and slid it toward me. It was a bank printout showing 3 wires from a Delaware entity directly to a private trust fund registered in Nassau. The beneficiary of the Nassau Trust was not Julian Hayes. It was David Thorne, my father. The phantom ache in my broken chest returned for a brief second, sharp and sour. My father didn't just cover up the accident afterward, I whispered, my fingers crumpling the edge of the sheet. He was already working with Julian before Clara died. He traded his oldest daughter for $30 million in liquidity. Yes, Vance said, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his eyes filled with a grim, heavy sympathy. This transaction was cleared 4 hours before her car hit the guardrail on Interstate 93. It was her discovery of this exact ledger entry that likely cost her life. My throat felt tight, but my head was perfectly cold. If my father received the money, I said, then Julian must have received the signed transfer authorization from him. But under our corporate charter, my father's transfer of Thorne Logistics stock is legally invalid without the sister trust release. Which is missing, Vance noted, turning the keys to start the engine. Which I am going to find first, I said. But as we pulled back onto the busy Boston streets, my mind was racing with a sudden, dark calculation. If Julian was already working with my father, he would know about the Nassau account codes. He would also know that Clara's personal safe deposit box at Boston Private Bank had been scheduled for inventory next Tuesday. Last time the safe deposit box was found completely empty when the family opened it. I had assumed Clara simply had no valuables there. This time I realized with a shock of cold dread, Julian must have already loaded the safe box prior to her official funeral service. "We need to go to Devonshire Street immediately," I told Vance, my hands turning white as I gripped the dashboard. "The bank closes at 4 p.m. It is 3:40 right now." Vance stepped hard on the gas, the old engine roaring as we headed toward the financial district. But even as we moved through the traffic, a sinking feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. My first use of the reborn timeline was about to face its first real friction. Part 5. The Unexpected Sigil at the Bank. The vaulted marble ceiling of Boston Private Bank looked like an ancient Roman temple designed to protect old, stolen wealth. I rushed through the heavy brass revolving doors at exactly 3:50 p.m., my breath catching in my throat as the cool air conditioning hit my skin. Vance followed 3 steps behind, his leather briefcase held tightly under his arm. The clerk behind the marble counter was an elegant, middle-aged woman named Cynthia. She knew our family well. She had processed Clara's trust transactions for nearly 4 years. "Cynthia," I said, leaning over the brass barrier, trying to keep my voice smooth and untroubled, "I need to access Clara's deposit box. My father requested I retrieve some insurance papers for the funeral service tomorrow." Cynthia looked up, her expression morphing from polite professional to deep concern. She adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at her computer monitor. "Oh, Miss Thorne," she said softly. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. It is an absolute tragedy." "Thank you," I said, my heart drumming against my ribs like a trapped bird. "May I sign the ledger for vault entry?" Cynthia hesitated, her fingers typing a brief sequence into her keyboard. "I am afraid your brother-in-law-to-be, Mr. Hayes, has already processed that access," she said gently. The blood went completely cold in my veins. "Mr. Hayes was here 20 minutes ago with your father's signed authorization," Cynthia continued, turning the screen slightly toward me. "He stated that the insurance policies were required by the municipal office before 4 p.m. "Did he sign the vault log?" Vance asked, stepping forward, his voice losing all its dull attorney softness. "Yes, Mr. Miller," Cynthia said, tapping a physical logbook lying open on her desk. "He cleared the signature register just 10 minutes ago. He should still be in the private secure room in the basement level right now." I did not wait for Vance or Cynthia to invite me. I turned and ran down the winding stone stairs leading to the subterranean vaults. My shoes made no sound on the heavy wool carpets, but my pulse was a loud, heavy thrum in my ears. This was my first mistake in the reborn timeline. I had assumed Julian would act according to his old schedule, but by intervening with Vance and moving quickly, I had somehow triggered a faster sequence of events on his end. The heavy steel bars of the security gate in the basement were open. At the end of the narrow corridor of polished safety deposit drawers, there was a private viewing room with a heavy oak door left slightly ajar. I pushed the door open. Julian Hayes was standing under the soft overhead lamp. He was holding a thick, leather-bound book in his gloved hands. It was the original Thorne family stock ledger. He looked up as I entered. He did not look startled or guilty. His eyes were incredibly calm, a cold, striking blue that had once made me feel completely safe, but now filled me with a deep, visceral revulsion. "Madeline," he said, his voice as smooth and steady as it was the day he had shoved me off the Clarendon penthouse balcony. "What a surprise to find you here. Your father told me you were at home writing the memorial service tribute." He stepped toward me, closing the ledger with a quiet, dull thud. "You look pale, darling," he murmured, reaching out his hand as if to touch my shoulder. Part 6. The cold silence. If I screamed, he would know I had changed. If I called him a murderer in front of the bank guards, he would use his high-priced medical connections to suggest I was suffering from a grief-induced nervous breakdown. In the first timeline, he had used that exact technique to explain away my sudden isolation from my remaining friends, claiming I was suffering from severe postpartum-like trauma after Clara's death. I took a long, deep breath, forcing my heart rate down, letting my shoulder muscles go loose under my coat. I didn't step back from his hand, but I shifted my posture so his fingers only grazed the thick fabric of my coat lapel. "The house was so quiet, Julian," I said, my voice shaking just enough to mimic a young woman who was completely overwhelmed by grief. My stepmother Eleanor was arguing with the florists, and I couldn't write the obituary in that room, it felt too small. Julian's hand dropped back to his side. The suspicion in his eyes softened slightly, replaced by his familiar, patronizing warmth. I understand, he said softly, putting his gloves into his pocket while keeping his body angled to cover the ledger on the table. You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone. Your father asked me to handle these legal documents so you wouldn't have to face the cold business side of death today. Is that Clara's financial planner book? I asked, pointing a trembling finger toward the desk behind him, where two smaller red leather books lay next to his briefcase. Yes, Julian replied, smiling with a calculated kindness. Just some tedious investment records. I need to take them to the probate examiner's office before they close. I looked at the red books, then looked directly into his eyes. In my memory of the future there were 3 red books, not 2. Clara had kept her true transaction register in a plain black moleskin binder with a small silver elastic strap. He hadn't found the black binder yet because it wasn't in her bank deposit box. It was hidden inside the antique typewriter casing she kept on display in her study at our father's Newton house. Julian thought he had captured the queen's pieces, but he had only taken the pawns. Okay, I said, looking down at my hands. Will you be coming to dinner tonight? Father says the legal advisors need to sign some emergency papers before the wake tomorrow. Of course, Julian said, his hand sliding smoothly over the black leather briefcase as he packed the 2 red books away. I will always be there to help you hold things together, Madeline. You are the only person who matters to me now. His lie sounded so perfect it was almost beautiful. But as I looked at the side of his neck where a tiny, pale scar was barely visible above his collar, my mind returned to that final night on the 22nd floor. I had scratched him there as he grabbed my forearms to lever me over the balcony edge. That scar was not there yet. I turned away from him and walked back to where Vance was waiting near the vault security desk. As soon as we were out of Julian's sight, my shoulders tightened. He has the secondary books, I told Vance in a low whisper as we walked back up the stone steps, but he does not have the transaction codes from Clara's primary journal. We must go to Newton immediately before my stepmother opens Clara's personal rooms for the funeral visitors. If my father realizes we are there, he will block my entry. Leave your father's house to me, Vance said, his glasses catching the street lights outside the bank. I will send him a formal estate disclosure request that requires his immediate presence at our downtown office. It will buy you exactly 2 hours. Part 7. The Invasion of the Golden Age. The Thorne Estate in Newton was a $5 million stone Tudor house built on 2 acres of manicured lawn behind a high iron gate. At 4:40 p.m., the autumn sunlight was starting to fail, throwing long, skeletal shadows across the red brick driveway. The butler, an old family retainer named Gregory, looked surprised to see me walking through the back service entrance. Miss Madeline, he said, bowing his head. I thought you were with your father at the legal offices on State Street. He was summoned there for an emergency audit half an hour ago. I had forgotten to sign a release for the flower delivery, Gregory, I said, moving past him with a quick, soft pace. I will be upstairs in Clara's old rooms, trying to select a formal dress for the service. Please don't disturb me for the next hour. Of course, Miss, Gregory murmured, turning back to his task of polished silver tea trays in the pantry. The stairs to the 3rd floor were carpeted in dark crimson. Every portrait of our ancestors on the wood-paneled walls seemed to watch me with hollow, paint-scraped eyes. Clara's bedroom had already been cleaned of its personal messiness by my stepmother's cleaning service. The bed sheets were stripped and replaced with smooth, crisp white covers that smelled like lavender bleach. Her desk was cleared of her active notebooks, her computer gone, and only a single silver photo frame of our mother remained on the wooden shelves. But in the far corner of the room, sitting on an antique wrought iron table, was old Smith Corona typewriter from 1954. Clara loved historical artifacts. She claimed typing on heavy iron keys kept her thoughts focused. I knelt before the table. My knees felt cold as they touched the polished hardwood floor. My fingers searched the back cover of the typewriter casing, feeling along the thick green felt liner near the lower frame. There was a tiny metal clasp designed to release the mechanical ribbon carriage. I clicked it to the left. With a soft, heavy clack, a small wooden compartment at the bottom of the casing dropped down into my palm. Inside lay a black moleskin journal with a worn silver elastic strap. I opened the first page, my eyes quickly scanning the tight, precise columns written in my sister's unmistakable handwriting. She had not used financial abbreviations. She had written down everything like an investigator building a grand homicide trial file. Julian has leased 4 shipping containers under the name Devon LLC, she wrote on September 23. The serial numbers are 64-B, 82-D, and 2 others at Boston Harbor Terminal 4. He is using Thorn Logistics Customs clearing IDs to move unchecked medical machinery imports. Father has authorized this by forging my administrative signatures. I turned the page, my hand trembling as I read the final entry written just 48 hours ago. Julian discovered my inquiry into Devon LLC today. He suggested I take the expressway route under rain to visit the storage warehouses tomorrow morning. He promised to meet me there with the custom records. I am printing copies to send to Vance Miller's Brookline address, just in case Julian's private company gets tipped off. I do not trust his smile. She never got to see his smile drop. A sharp floorboard creak echoed from the corridor outside the bedroom. I tucked the journal deep into the side pocket of my trench coat and stood up, my back immediately stiffening as the bedroom door slowly opened. It was Eleanor, my stepmother, holding a glass of dry white wine. Her sharp face was flushed with a mixture of alcohol and cold annoyance. "Madeline, what are you doing in here?" she asked, her thin eyebrows drawing together as her eyes tracked my hands. "This room is locked for probate appraisal. Your father gave very specific instructions that nobody was to touch Clara's items without Julian being present." "I am choosing address, Eleanor," I said, keeping my hands inside my trench coat pockets. "I have a right to look at my sister's things before the appraisers come." "Your father says you are being dramatic and difficult," she said, taking a slow sip from her glass. "Julian is trying his best to keep our estate secure from taxes, while you are wandering around Boston like an unwanted ghost. You need to grow up, Madeline. Tomorrow you will be standing in front of 200 guests from the Harbor Commission. Don't make that face." She walked closer, her expensive diamond ring clicking against her wine glass as she peered at the typewriter on the desk. "Is there anything in here you want to take?" she asked with a sharp sneer. "If you want her typewriter, just say so. Don't go hiding in the dark to steal it." "I don't need the typewriter, Eleanor," I said, walking right past her with a slow, deliberate calmness that seemed to catch her off guard. "I have already found what I was looking for." Part 8, The Chronology of the Shadows. The next day, October 15, 2021. The St. Mary's Church in Brookline was packed with floral arrangements of white calla lilies and gray velvet ribbons. In my previous life, I spent this morning hiding in the restroom, weeping until my eyes were completely bloodshot, while Julian held my hand in the pews and whispered how much he would protect me from my own weakness. This time my eyes were dry. My skin was cold, my posture perfect under a fitted black coat I had bought with my own savings, bypassing the dowdy wool garments Eleanor had left in my wardrobe. My father, David, stood at the foyer entrance, his hand shaking slightly as he accepted condolences from several Port Authority officials. His eyes looked red, but I knew his hands were shaking from the sheer panic of Vance Miller's unexpected estate inquiries yesterday afternoon. Vance was standing at the back of the chapel, dressed in his dull gray coat, a small blue notebook held discreetly under his left arm. He didn't look at me, but he nodded twice as I passed. Julian Hayes arrived 20 minutes before the formal service began. He looked incredibly elegant in his dark funeral coat. He walked with a smooth grace toward where my father and stepmother were seated in the front pew. "Madeline," he whispered, sliding into the bench next to me, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and expensive leather. "You look very strong today. It is a beautiful service." "It is, Julian," I said, looking straight at the dark mahogany coffin resting under the candle flames. "I think Clara would be pleased to know that her accounts are finally being looked over by professionals." Julian's body went imperceptibly stiff. His eyes shifted toward me, his brow furrowing with a tiny, sharp micro-expression. "The probate appraisers haven't started their search yet, darling," he said, keeping his voice extremely low and comforting. "I told your father it is best to let the emotions settle first." "But I didn't want them to wait," I replied, turning my head slowly to look him directly in the face. "I have actually given Vance Miller all of Clara's physical records this morning. He said they were necessary to complete the foreign asset audit." The color drained from Julian's face so fast his skin looked almost translucent under the chapel's stained glass windows. "What records did you give him, Madeline?" he asked, his voice losing its smooth gravel warmth, replaced by a harsh, thin whisper. All Clara's personal things were supposed to be packed under my corporate legal review. Just a small black notebook from her room, I said, smiling with a quiet, empty innocence. It had several details about Devon LC, and several shipping containers at Terminal 4. Vance thought it was incredibly helpful. He mentioned he might have to invite the harbor port authorities here this afternoon to clarify some issues with the manifest papers. Julian stood up immediately. His sudden motion caught the attention of 3 elders in the pew across the aisle, who looked at him with surprised disapproval. "I need to make a phone call to the estate offices," Julian muttered, his fingers tightening around his leather briefcase until the seams strained. "Excuse me for a minute, Madeline." "Take your time, Julian," I whispered, watching his long coat tail swish against the wooden benches as he hurried down the aisle toward the rear exit doors. But as I watched him walk away, I didn't feel any sense of celebration. The trap was open, but Vance and I were about to discover that a cornered predator is twice as fast and twice as cruel. Part 9. The Collision at Terminal 4. As soon as the first prayer of the funeral began, I slid out of the pew under the cover of the heavy choir singing, and hurried through the vestry doors to the side street. Vance was already waiting in his gray car, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched with intense focus. He didn't wait for me to explain. He slammed his foot on the gas as soon as I pulled my passenger door shut. "My contact inside the State Department of Transportation just sent me a warning message," Vance said, his voice clipped and quick as we darted through the Brookline side streets toward the Callan Tunnel. "Julian Hayes has already initiated an emergency custom release order for the 3 containers at Harbor Terminal 4. He's trying to load them onto a transport vessel departing for Halifax before 5 p.m. "Is the port police tipped off?" I asked, my fingers clutching the black moleskin notebook in my pocket. "They are, but they are stalling," Vance said, his brow sweating. "Julian has 2 inspectors on his monthly payment sheets. They are refusing to halt the loading procedure without an official judicial warrant from a Suffolk County judge. It takes at least 3 hours to get that signature under standard Boston procedures." "Then we don't have 3 hours," I said, looking out at the dirty gray waters of the Boston harbor approaching in the distance. At the gates of Terminal 4, the cold autumn wind was howling off the ocean, bringing with it the sharp smell of brine and rusted steel. Julian's black Land Rover was parked directly next to a heavy cargo crane near the water's edge. Under the crane's bright yellow lights, 3 large cargo containers painted a dull blue were being loaded onto the flatbed of a heavy transport vessel. Julian was standing near the metal catwalk, arguing with a harbor custom officer dressed in a reflective yellow safety vest. We got out of Vance's car and walked straight into the salt wind, our coats whipping against our legs. "Mr. Hayes," Vance shouted, his voice ringing out across the concrete expanse, surprisingly loud over the heavy groan of the crane engines. "Halt that transport immediately under the authority of the Thorne Family Trust Administrative Injunction." Julian spun around, his hair was ruffled by the sea wind, his perfect aristocratic face twisted into a snarl of pure rage. "Get these state workers off this platform, Miller," Julian yelled, pointing a gloved hand at us. "You have no legal jurisdiction to hold this cargo. Your family's logistics company is currently $30 million in debt to our holdings." "Actually, Julian, they aren't," I said, stepping past Vance into the cold spray of the water. The crane operator paused the heavy cable hoist, leaving the 40-foot shipping container suspended 20 feet in the air, swinging slowly between us like a massive steel pendulum. I pulled the black moleskin binder from my pocket and held it up, my eyes locked on his pale blue ones. "Your debt assertions are based on forged transfers processed by my father without my mother's estate consent," I said, my voice steady, freezing cold, and completely carrying over the harbor winds. "My sister documented the dates of your forgery on September 16th, October 2nd, and October 8th. She kept the signature patterns from the bank logs." Julian laughed, a harsh, dry sound that had no humor in it. "Your sister is dead, Madeline," he sneered, stepping closer, his boots clicking on the wet metal deck. "And that little black book of hers is nothing but hearsay. No court in Boston is going to accept a deceased accountant's personal notes over my certified signatures." "Perhaps not a civil court," Julian Vance Miller said, his face breaking into a wide, triumphant grin. He reached into his leather coat and pulled out a heavy black walkie-talkie, clicking the side button twice. "But I think the Securities and Exchange Commission along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation will accept them just fine," Vance continued. especially since they have been tracking Devon LLC's imports since 7 a.m. this morning, when I filed our first joint federal disclosure request under the Patriot Act financial review provisions. A high-pitched siren began to wail from the entrance of the terminal yards. 3 dark blue police interceptor SUVs tore through the security gates, their red and blue strobes flashing across the steel sides of the cargo containers. Julian's eyes widened, a sudden, wild panic flickering in his gaze as his head whipped back to look his Land Rover. He stepped back toward the catwalk, his hands slipping inside his leather coat. He didn't scream or curse. He simply looked at me, his eyes dark, calculated, and completely desperate. "You think you won this round, Madeline?" he whispered, his breath visible as white steam in the sea air. "If I go down, your father's name will be dragged through the mud of every newspaper from Boston to London. You will have absolutely nothing left of your family name." "My sister Clara was my family, Julian," I said, looking at him with the same absolute coldness he had shown me before shoving me to the Boston pavement. "My father traded her life for $42 million. You can take him with you to the concrete floor of your new cell. I don't care about the Thorn name anymore." A heavy, dark-clothed officer from the Federal Tactical Division stepped onto the platform, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Julian Hayes, keep your hands where I can see them," the officer shouted. "You are being detained under a federal warrant for interstate financial fraud and customs smuggling." Julian didn't fight. He let his hands go slowly into the air, his fingers limp as the metal cuffs clicked over his wrists. But as the police guided him past me toward the interceptors, he paused, his eyes finding mine one last time in the salt mist. "How did you know about the Worcester rental?" he muttered, his voice dropping so low only I could hear. "The black van was cleaned out 48 hours ago. How did you know where to look?" I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I simply adjusted my coat and watched him get pushed into the back of the police car, the blue door slamming shut on his world forever. Part 10: The Peaceful Heart. 2 months later, the wind in Boston was biting cold, but it carried the clean, dry promise of fresh snow. The Moakley Federal Courthouse on the Seaport waterfront had finished its preliminary hearings on the Sterling Hayes and Thorn Logistics collective indictment. My father, David, had signed a plea deal for 20 years to avoid a life-term trial, his shipping yards confiscated by the federal receiver to cover the stolen pension funds of his 800 dock workers. My stepmother, Eleanor, had relocated to her sister's tiny apartment in New Hampshire, her luxury Newton properties sold off at public auction to cover the massive state tax debts. And I was sitting in the quiet lounge of the Boston Athenaeum, drinking a warm cup of herbal tea next to a heavy wood fire. Vance Miller walked into the library, his spectacles perched securely on his nose, a small envelope held in his hand. He sat down in the leather chair across from me, the warm firelight casting a cozy glow on his navy blazer. "The court cleared the residual trust recess today, Madeline," he said, his voice quiet out of respect for the library's reading rules. "The $60,000 remaining legacy funds have been safely moved to your personal checking account. It is not a $30 million fortune, but it is completely yours, free of your family's history." I looked at the window, where the first gentle white flakes of winter were starting to settle on the red brick facades of Beacon Hill. "It is more than enough, Vance," I said. "I think Clara would have liked this quiet room." "She would have loved it," he said softly, reaching out to clasp his fingers gently over my hand. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, my chest didn't feel heavy. The ribs that had once broken on Clarendon Street felt whole, steady, and light as I leaned back in my chair and watched the snow fall outside. I was no longer the second daughter waiting to be forgotten. I was the woman who had returned from the winter sky to make sure her family's shadow was finally erased from the cold Boston earth. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.